Okay, well, thank you for attending. Um, People who visited Bristol Museum and Art Gallery before may well be very familiar with the Jacob Jordan's painting of the Nativity. It's one of the treasures of our European Old Masters collection, and it was a fixture in our Old Masters Gallery here at Bristol Museum and Art Gallery up until 2016, when we took it down so that the gallery it was in could be refurbished as part of a wider project for all the art galleries. And we thought that at that point we would take the opportunity to undertake a full conservation treatment of the work. It was the first full treatment it had had since 1939. Running repairs had been carried out on it over the years as problems had been noted. There were blisters of the paint noted in the 1960s. There were flaking cracks in the 1970s, and those problems were recurring and noted over the decades. So we thought it was a good moment to look at the painting thoroughly and see what treatment was needed. And as I said, none of these problems were new, and when the painting had its last full treatment in 1939, it was by Hans Schubart, who at the time was a freelance painting conservator in London, but subsequently came to Bristol as the curator and actually became the director of the Bristol Art Gallery. But his correspondence that we have in our records about that treatment noted that unfortunately the picture had so many cracks which undoubtedly disturb, by which he means sort of disturb the viewer's experience of the picture, unless they are filled in, smoothed over and carefully retouched. And if you have a chance to read the rest of that letter, it shows that it gives an insight into some of the decisions that a conservator has to make about the extent of a treatment and how much needs to be done to make a damaged painting legible to the viewer again. And also shows that the budgetary constraints appear to be nothing new. Especially as in his next letter, dated only 2 days later, but having had a letter back from the director of the Museum and Art Gallery in between, shows that the museum wasn't willing to stump up the money for the extra treatment. And also implies that the director was quite ambitiously, given the size of this picture, trying to fit it into his car. But thankfully, there's a subsequent letter from March 1939 that says that the work on the painting, once it was returned to Bristol, was much admired and all agreed that the restoration had been most skillfully done. So we know at least that one ended well. The main reason for all the cracks that were causing problems for Hans Schubart, and that have caused problems over the years, is the construction of the wooden panel that this particular painting is on. Large paintings on wood are generally constructed from a number of planks, the number varying depending on the size. They're usually arranged vertically because that's when they're most stable. And with a portrait, such as this one here, the portrait of Francis Creswick that's on display at M-Shed usually, you can see that they usually arrange 3 planks with one in the middle so that there isn't a join right up the middle of the face. And so there's no disruption caused by that. Because the problem with wood, as one of the problems with wood as a support for a painting, is that when the humidity changes in the environment that the picture is in, the wood wants to move, it wants to expand and contract in response to those changes. And once the paint on that wood is dry and has aged, it's not flexible enough to move with it, and so it cracks and ultimately can flake off, leaving quite a characteristic pattern of loss, which you can see in this picture. The complicating factor for the Jordans is that it's painted on 15 pieces of wood, and these lines show how those pieces are arranged. Now, as well as making life hard for generations of conservators, this arrangement is also one of the giveaways for probably the biggest secret that this painting holds, which is that there is another completely different painting underneath the one you can currently see. So close examination of the surface of the painting shows that here and there are textures and brush strokes that don't seem to relate to the current image. And in 1979, that led the conservator who was here then to X-ray the central portion to find out what was going on with that. And this is a mosaic of those X-ray plates all put together. And to make that maybe a bit easier to read and figure out, here's the painting again. And then here are the X-rays laid over the top. Now the lighter areas in the X-ray image are where there are pigments that absorb X-ray in the paint. And so they show up on the plates. Notably in this picture, it'll be mostly the flesh paint of the figures because that's got a lot of lead white pigment in it. And hopefully you can see the face of the figure of Mary quite clearly, and also the cherubs in the top right, and hopefully also still the ox kind of peering out at us just right of center. But when the X-ray mosaic is turned round by 90 degrees, there are some of the features that aren't in the nativity that start to become apparent. So hopefully here and here you can see some faces, and then over here there's a sort of vertical shape that looks like a staff with a hand around it and an arm. And then up here there are some legs and what could be a wing and some extra drapery. And then down in the bottom left there's a whole extra dog. Usefully for us, Jacob Jordaens and his studio often produced multiple copies or versions of some compositions. And looking at other works of his finds this, the Return of the Holy Family from Egypt, which is now at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum in Providence in the USA. Now it's much smaller than the central portion of the Nativity and it's on canvas, but nonetheless the composition looks to be almost identical from what we can see in these features in the X-ray. So it would seem that originally the central 4 planks of the Nativity were arranged vertically and painted with this scene of the Return of the Holy Family from Egypt. And the level of detail that we can see in the X-ray implies that it wasn't abandoned at an early stage, that this was either completely finished or very nearly finished as a painting. And this can also be seen in paint samples. So hints of this can be seen in paint samples that were taken during the current treatment to try and answer other questions, but also showed this. So here is the exact sample site of one taken from Mary's blue robe, the sample site showing it after all the varnish and retouching was removed. And these samples, although they're tiny, so this photo gives a sense of just how small they are. Your average human hair is about 20 to 40 microns in width. When they're looked at under extreme magnification, they can show all the paint layers that are present in the spot that the sample was taken from. And here underneath the layers of blue that are related to Mary's robe, underneath that, there are extra layers that have, you can see little orange and red dots that are the orange and red pigment particles. And given the position of the sample, it's likely that that is some of the drapery or the flesh paint from the sort of falling figure in the top left corner there. So we get more idea of that composition underneath. As well as the information we got from the X-rays, in taking the opportunity we had from 2015 to look at the picture in more detail, by happy coincidence, around the same time, the Jordaens Van Dyck Panel Paintings project, which is a collaboration between the Royal Museums of Fine Arts Belgium and the University of Amsterdam, contacted us to ask about coming to the museum to analyse our painting for inclusion in their project. So we leapt at that chance. And one of the types of analysis that can be done on paintings on wood is dendrochronology. And in doing that, the growth rings of the wood, where they're visible at the cut edges, they're counted and measured and then compared against reference databases. And then that dating information combined with other data, including the geographical origin of the wood and knowledge about how planks were prepared historically for use as painting supports, means that we can come up with an earliest possible date, which is known as the terminus post quem, for the felling of the tree in question and it being sawn into planks for use. So the project's dendrochronologist carried this out, and her results showed that the latest of the panels used for the outer parts of the nativity has a terminus post quem of 1634. And what that means, it is therefore impossible for the painting to date from before that time. So the extension put onto the outside of the return of the Holy Family from Egypt cannot date from before 1634. We're not entirely sure how long afterwards, how long after the tree was felled that the plank would have been used. It can be as little as 2 years, it could have been much longer, but it gives us that firm date for when before which it can't have been painted. Now, for obvious reasons, it has to have been later than the painting that's underneath it. The frustrating thing about having the panel having been extended on all sides is that the edges of the original planks aren't available for doing this kind of analysis on. But if we assume that the first one was painted, the Return from Egypt was painted around the same time as the version in Rhode Island, and there are other versions, then it probably dates from the mid-1610s. And given that we know that the Nativity can't have been painted earlier than 1634, it implies that the first painting, unless it somehow left Jordan's studio and then ended up back there again, must have stayed there for 20 years or so before being extended and then painted over to form our current painting here. Now, we can only speculate as to why that might be. It could be that the first picture was painted for a specific commission and then the person who'd commissioned it didn't want it. Or one possibility is that it could have acted as sort of a display model, a studio example piece for potential patrons who came to the studio to see what Jordan's and his workshop were capable of. That sort of extends in the life of this painting, because it's probable that the Nativity is mentioned in the sale catalogue of paintings that were in Jacob Jordan's studio at the time of his death. They weren't sold until 1734 when his grandchildren sold them, but they were sold as a group that had been in his possession, and this could be lot 32 from that sale. And so given that Jordan's died fairly suddenly in 1678, it seems that this one also stayed in his studio for a very long time. Again, we don't know why, but it's possible it could have served the same purpose again. And whatever the reason, we can hopefully suppose that meant Jordan's was quite fond of it. And hopefully we've carried that on. We're all certainly very fond of it, and we hope our visitors are as well. So that brings us pretty much up to date, really. The current treatment is well underway. It's had some hold-ups. We've waited to do various types of analysis. Obviously, most recently, lockdown has meant work hasn't been able to carry on it. But before that, what we'd chosen to do was to remove the discoloured varnish and all the subsequent restoration, so that it got back to just what remains of what Jordan's painted, and that is this. Now, thankfully, the damage was mostly restricted to the pattern of loss related to the complex structure, like we saw earlier on, and around the vulnerable edges, which are always most likely to suffer loss in a painting. So that was quite a relief to know that there wasn't a huge amount of other damage as well. And if I manage to swivel round here and then stop sharing my screen, then you can see, and if you put me onto the speaker view, then you should be able to see the painting as it currently is in the background. So that retouching of all those damages and losses is well underway at the moment. I'm grappling with exactly the same issues that Hans Schubart recorded as having problems with. The joins between those panels aren't even, so you've got to try and integrate them back into the image without them being too distracting, but also without having to cover up any of the remaining original to try and even out those gaps. So it's a challenge, but it's getting there. And then once it's finished, it will reclaim its place in our galleries again. And hopefully by then, you'll all be able to come back and see it once again in all its glory. We look forward to seeing you then. And I will hand back to Kate now for any questions anybody might